Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Tanner. I am the director of the centre-right think tank Onward. We were established in 2018 to boost economic opportunity and strengthen community in all parts of the country, especially in those places that have felt most left behind. And I am delighted to welcome you this morning to this event looking at the realignment of the British electorate and its implications for the next general election. We are today launching a major new study called Another Brick in the Wall, which doesn't include new polling, but it does look at the kind of undercurrents of British politics, focusing less on the kind of choppy waters or the froth on top, but more on what's happening underneath the surface and the extent to which demographics and changing characteristics of voters are changing where in the country different parties might perform. In 2019, the Conservative Party defied both history and pollsters' expectations to demolish what was known as the Red Wall across the north of England, including in seats that had never before voted Conservative. The Red Wall, to use James Canigazorian's term, fell in spectacular fashion. But just a few years later, the focus is increasingly turning elsewhere. In 3 by-elections in Cheshire and Amersham, in North Shropshire and Bexley and Old Sidcup, the Conservatives have jettisoned nearly 60,000 votes since their 2019 high watermark, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats are increasingly talking about a Lib-Lab pact in order to unseat Conservatives at the next election. And that was all before Partygate and indeed the price and tax rises that are yet to bite. So what should we believe? Where should our focus be? Will the battlegrounds be in the north or in the south in 2024? Is the blue wall real? And how easily could a Lib-Lab pact demolish it? Are the Conservatives' new northern heartlands likely to stick or twist? And what would happen if, as rumoured, Nigel Farage returns to the front line of British politics? Today, we're going to get into some of those questions, and I'm delighted to introduce a truly star-studded panel to get into them. So our first speaker will be James Blagden, who will take you through 5 just key headlines from Onward's report this morning. You can read the full thing at ukonward.com. I will then turn to James Canigazorian, who is the man who originally coined the term Red Wall, who is joining virtually, and he will talk us through his response to the findings and indeed his thoughts on the kind of longer-term shifts in British politics. We will then turn to Sebastian Payne, the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times, a long-time observer of some of these trends, and the author of Broken Heartlands, I think by most accounts, the definitive account of how Labour lost its seats at the last general election. And then I will turn to Rachel Wolf, the founder of Public First, former advisor to Boris Johnson, and others in the Conservative Party, and a co-author of the 2019 general election, to perhaps talk a little bit about what this means in terms of policy and indeed how this might play out if there was, as some people expect, a leadership race following votes of no confidence in the Prime Minister. So we have a lot to get through today. Thank you for tuning in. But before we turn to the panel, if I could ask my colleague James Blagden to take us through a few key findings from the report. James.
Thanks, Will. So, what we do in our research? Well, we're going to spend 5 or 6 minutes going through five main findings from our paper. We answer questions like, where is battleground next election? Is the blue wall real? And would a Lib-Lab pact actually work? So, number 1, firstly, there is no blue wall. The blue wall, if it exists, should follow the same pattern as the red wall, but in reverse. Should be a cluster of seats where demographics would favour Labour or the Lib Dems, but in fact those seats vote Conservative consistently at the time. The map here shows all Conservative seats where the party overperformed demographics by more than 5 points. And you can see that in the home counties, It's roughly as conservative as you'd expect based on the profile of the area. More homeowners, more older voters, less urban. And actually you find these outperforming seats spread all across the country, which reflects the fact that the Conservative coalition is much more evenly spread and much more efficiently spread than it was last time. Two, the real battleground is in the north of England. So according to our demographic model, Conservatives are most vulnerable in regions like Yorkshire, the North East and the North West. The map here shows those battleground seats, not accounting for National Swing, of course. And 60% of those are in the north of England, only 20% in the south. And this tells us two things about kind of the next election. One is that for the Conservatives, the bulk of potential losses would be in the north of England rather than the south. And secondly, if there are gains to be made, if they could make ground anywhere, that will also be in the north of England. Three, there is a longer term blue drift in the south. Between 2015 and 19, 35 seats saw Conservative vote share decline by 10 points or more. And all of those, bar two, are in the south of England, this kind of pale to dark red blob down here. And this includes seats like Witney and Maidenhead, high profile seats of former Conservative Prime Ministers. Part of this is a post-Brexit realignment. Think of Surrey seats like Esher and Bolton. And part is actually a 30 to 40 year trend where counties like East Sussex and Cambridgeshire are drifting slowly away from the Conservative Party since the 80s. So if this trend continues, we would expect these seats down here to become more and more marginal over time for Conservatives. Four, a Lib-Lab pact won't work. We've heard from Labour and Lib Dem camps recently they'd be open to some sort of informal non-aggression pact at the next election. The question is, would this be enough to get the Tories out? No, not really. Even if it worked perfectly, so in seats where Labour are the main challenger, all Lib Dem voters backed Labour and vice versa, the Conservative Party would still win 321 seats. The largest party in Parliament, and depending on the number of Sinn Féin abstentions, could even be a small working majority. The combined strength of Labour and the Lib Dems under this scenario would only be 257, which is actually worse than Jeremy Corbyn achieved on his own in 2017. So those who think that the main strategy for Labour, the main path to victory, is through a progressive alliance are mistaken. The data doesn't support that view. And five, the Tories should watch out for Newkip. Earlier research has shown that the Brexit Party cost the Conservatives 25 seats at the last election. That would have increased Boris Johnson's majority from 80 to 130. We asked in our research, what would be the impact of a resurgent party on the right, a party that occupies the same political niche as the Brexit Party and Newkip did at their height? And the result is that it would cost the Conservatives 53 seats across the UK, which would wipe out their majority and generate up in Parliament. Although a credible challenger has yet to emerge in that space, I think Reform polling at 3 to 4% on their good days, the Conservatives should watch this space with a keen eye. So those are our main findings, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Take a seat. Now, I'm conscious that we've had a few comments saying that sound quality is poor. I hope that if we all speak up, that may resolve itself, but please do let us know if that doesn't occur. So, James Canigazorian, can I now come to you as the man who originally coined "Turn the Red Wall"? I'd be fascinated on your to know your thoughts on both this report, but more generally, how do you see the kind of realignment of British politics continuing?
Thanks, Will, and I hope the sound is clear at my end, and a pleasure to speak along Rachel and Seb and James. Thanks for the interesting presentation. I think what I'll say, it might sound like a critique of the report, which might seem strange given that I sit on the board of Onward, but I think it's probably 90 degrees away from the thrust. So I've got four key points to make in regards to the blue wall, whether it exists. I think the first thing I would say is on the overperformance analysis that James conducted, which was where did the Conservatives do better than you would expect? The pattern is very different from the Labour position and the Conservative position in 2017. There isn't, for example, a massive contiguous swathe of seats with a very large degree of overperformance on the Conservative part and underperformance on the Labour. Nonetheless, I think the pattern there is much more related to historical incumbency. If you flick through to the slide where you look at Conservative overperformance, it's basically seats that were taken by David Cameron or Michael Howard back in 2005 and 2010. In other words, areas where they're not true blue areas, but they're areas that have turned and have got steadily more conservative outside of the demographic profile. The second point I would make about battleground is this. I don't think we actually know where the battleground will be at the next election yet, because we don't know where the parties will end up in terms of vote share. And fundamentally, the battleground is driven by the national polling vote share, as much as it is by leader ratings, as much as it is by how each party polls on which issue. I mean, a good example of that is at the 2019 election. The Conservative Party won, I think, 345 seats in England. Fundamentally, if you had just swapped in the Conservative 2017 vote numbers, but kept everybody else the same as just a kind of thought exercise, the Conservatives still would have got 331 seats at the 2019 election in England only. In other words, 70% of the last election on a raw seat count was basically explained by the Labour position and the Labour brand, and Jeremy Corbyn in particular, who was uniquely unpopular to two very different groups of people on national security issues to more Leave-orientated voters, particularly in the Red Wall, but also on economic issues, much further away from a lot of voters in the South who are more fiscally conservative. So that will be my second point is we don't know where the battleground will be yet. It won't necessarily be only concentrated in the north. It might be a very large and complex battleground that will shift depending on the parameters. The third point I would make on the Lib-Lab pact point is I think it depends on whether it would work. I don't think it's as dry cut as it won't work, it will cut. On those numbers, it looks like it costs the Conservatives 40 seats, which may not sound like a lot in 2019, but is a massive difference maker in a scenario that is structurally closer. And I think also that there are many different models that can be done. And in terms of pacts, whether they're informal, how they're done, who stands where, I think at the minute we're still, both voters and analysts are still getting to grips with how pacts are evolving and how they might look like. I think the fourth point on Newkip, I think the findings here are quite similar to those of Rob Ford and Paula Surridge and Tim Bale's gold standard study of the 2019 election, where I think to my surprise they found that the existence of the Brexit Party potentially cost the Conservative Party, I think 25 seats at the 2019 general election. So I can see in terms of a kind of legacy 2019 analysis that is broadly correct, that the kind of Nigel Farage threat still stands. But what I would point out is that the aggregate Reform or Brexit Party vote share plus the Conservative Party vote share is now structurally slightly lower than it was. And fundamentally, the things that are really shifting polls are the numbers of people going into don't knows and the numbers of people who are direct switches. And that has structurally a much bigger effect on the final outcome of an election. But broadly, I think it's a really interesting paper. My final reflection would be, this reminds me a lot of the paper that Neil O'Brien and Anthony Wells of YouGov wrote in 2010 called Northern Lights, which for another think tank for policy exchange, which I think was really interesting because it was a bit of a 20-year forward look. And actually, I think this piece of research is less useful for the next election. It is actually a very interesting piece about the 20-30 year realignment of both two main political parties. The order in which constituencies are Labour and Conservative is changing, and this is made most clear by this paper. But what the absolute levels of vote share are is driven by many things that are completely outside geodemographics. And on that final point, I don't think realignment in one particular way is ever unilateral or reversible. Looking through the data, one of the most interesting elections that occurred was the 1992 election, where John Major gained an unexpected majority on, I think, then the largest ever number of votes ever cast for a British Prime Minister. And I think that record still stands. And what was really interesting, if you study the 1992 election, is actually the Conservative Party realignment reversed versus what had happened under the Thatcher years. So during the 80s, the Conservative Party vote share structurally got much more rural and much more working class. And under the 1992 election under Major, it became hugely more affluent, probably as a function of the election campaign that was waged during that period. But it shows that realignment never goes in one way. It can quickly reverse. Things are contingent, things can change. I don't think anything is inexorable and nothing is clear. I'm sorry, but it's not a very clear answer, but that would be my reflection.
James, thank you very much. There's a huge amount for us to get into in there. Seth, can I come to you next?
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks, James, and for that really interesting thoughts there. So I've actually spent the past couple of weeks working on a new chapter of my book, which is coming out in paperback this summer. About this question of the blue wall, and I think I've been focused on Eastern Walton, which I think is a seat you mentioned as well, as one that is certainly fading away from the Conservatives. And when Dominic Raab first took that seat, it had, I think, almost a 20,000 majority. It's now down to 2,000. And obviously, we've got the last election, which was a very potent Brexit debate. And the fact was that Eastern Walton is about 50-51% Remain. Dominic Raab, as we know, is very much a Leaver. But the main thing I found from my research and the time I spent on the ground speaking to senior Lib Dems about this so far is the big thing with the not having the next election is not Jeremy Corbyn, and that should not be underestimated by Conservatives in terms of how that will change people's calculation, their vote. There are lots of people I've spoken to in Eastern Walton said, I voted Conservative because I did not want Jeremy Corbyn. And to put it very bluntly, at the next election, if you vote, say, Lib Dem, and you end up with Keir Starmer, that's a very different proposition. He is someone who speaks much more to maybe the values and the mindset of people of Surrey than you would have Jeremy Corbyn. So that is the first game changer. And I think that historically, the Liberal Democrats always do better when Labour has a more moderate leader. So of course, their big breakthrough was in 1997 when they faced Tony Blair. So again, it gives you that license to vote for a party and the way that you might get a prime minister. It doesn't matter so much to Labour PM. The flip side, of course, is that I imagine the next election with regards to these seats will be 2015 revisited, and that the Tories will look to wheel out the messaging that was used very effectively to destroy the Lib Dems, which was vote Lib Dem, get SNP. And the message was very clear is if you vote Lib Dem, you'll have Nicola Sturgeon deciding your taxes, plus having another independence referendum, plus breaking the country apart. And that was very effective last time. We will see if it's effective this time, because I remember the phrase coalition chaos comes to mind. I think given the past 7 years in British politics, that might not be so effective using that these days. So my sense is there's a good 10 seats that are in that band, I think we'll highlight in the report, that are certainly vulnerable to the Lib Dems at the next election. Whether they have that sort of contiguous shared demographic nature that James highlighted in the red wall, I'm still not so convinced by that, and I think that's the key thing of this report. There is not a clear blue wall. The seats are not geographically linked. They're all very different in terms of where they go, and therefore it's quite hard to project certain things across the whole piece here. And you mentioned the by-elections that we had obviously there were very significant by-election factors in there. North Shropshire was people being very annoyed at the Conservatives over Partygate, Owen Paterson, and also in Cheshire and Amersham planning. But one thing that was highlighted by both the campaigns I've spoken to in those places were the Conservatives' ground game basically was lacking in both those places. And they feel that over the past 5 years, the ground operation of the party has not kept pace with where the Lib Dems have got, where Labour have got to, and there's obviously been a lot of turnover at the Conservative Party HQ that I think has played into that. So I think how that changes will be very crucial, because the Lib Dems are very good ground campaigners. I'm talking about the Lib Dems here because I think all these seats I think we're talking about are Lib Dem facing, and there's 90 seats where the Lib Dems came second to the Tories the last election. And that's very easy for the Lib Dems because you've got a very clear message and it's very clear geographical divide. There's only a handful of urban-facing seats. One of them, I think, is Sheffield, Hallam, and then there's Altrincham and Braintree. But apart from that, they're nearly all in this particular geographic pattern. But within that, demographically, economically, very different. It's quite odd talking about this at this moment when obviously we've still got this question mark, who is going to be leading the Tory party in the next election? Because for me, that is probably the single biggest factor in all of this, that so much of 2019 has been written, just by on this panel, is about Boris Johnson's personal appeal to the country and to these places. His ratings have taken an absolute battering, and there's a lot of debate, I think, in the cabinet, but also high levels within the Tory party about can they ever recover. Now, they don't necessarily need to recover to where they were in 2019, but they need to be back in a similar kind of ball game. And I imagine the way the Tories will look at the next election is going to be not, do you want Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer to be your next Prime Minister? Because I think if they did that, Keir Starmer would probably come out on top of that based on where we're at now. But it's more about the party messaging and what kind of platform the Tories are putting forward in terms of economics, in terms of public policy, and saying which has the best, most compelling offer to the country. So in fact, it's a pivot away from where we were in 2017, of course, which was very heavily focused on Theresa May's Conservative Party. 2019 was sort of Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, but also get Brexit done. I think we often overestimate how much of it was about Boris and how much it was about that, just getting Brexit done and that relentless message. So the unanswered question, and I think James is right, we won't know until we have a shape of what the next election is going to look like, is going to be what terms is it being fought on. If it's an election on the economy, which would be my basis at this moment, then all that's going to depend on how inflation goes, how tax rise goes, how the Ukraine situation is going to affect the global economy, because this thing could really spiral and have a massive damping effect on all Western countries. And at that point, what's Labour's alternative? What's their track record on that kind of stuff? So I think the blue wall is definitely one to watch, but I think the reason it matters so much is if the Tories lose, say, 30 of those classic marginal, shall we call them, the kind of seats that David Cameron and Matt Howard won, that then knocks off your majority. It only takes another 10 or so Lib Dem seats to then put you into hung parliament or minority government territory. So it does matter, and I imagine there will be a lot of focus on it at the next election. And just the last thing on the pact point that you mentioned now, there will not be any formal pact whatsoever. There's no appetite. It's in the constitution of both parties to sign candidates anywhere. That is not changing. But the question, in fact, is the Labour Party is basically bankrupt. I mean, monetarily, it's got very little money. The Lib Dems don't have a lot of money either. So there is going to be a natural targeting of resources, and both parties can do MRPs, they can do polling, and they can very clearly see which way things are going. So I think even if there's not a formal alliance, you can see places, and when we see the Electoral Commission returns for the by-elections, you will see that's happening already. That, you know, if you look at how much money and folks Lib Dems did in Batley and Spen versus Cheshire and Amersham versus Bexley and Owen City Cup, you can see that informal stuff behind the scenes is happening. Are there back channels between the Lib Dems and Labour? Absolutely. We've reported on that in the FT. That will only grow, but I don't think there will be any kind of telling people which way to vote. Voters don't like that for a start. I think at that point, I'll show up and I'll let Rachel come.
Thank you very much, Seth. You touched on a lot there. You kind of mentioned leadership, and you also mentioned the kind of future direction of the Tory party. One question, Rachel, is, I guess, what does this all mean for policy? Because there is a kind of battle raging either in proxy form or in real terms about the future direction of conservatism, about whether it should Cameronite position or potentially more Thatcherite positions in some respects, or it should continue along its current trajectory and try and appeal more to perhaps Northern and Midlands voters. I'm wondering your perspective on what this means for Conservatism.
Yes, thank you. I'm conscious sound is not great, so I will try and talk slowly and just make a small number of points. So first, picking up from what James and Seth have said, there are large numbers of things that are not in any potential leader or MP's control. They cannot control the fact that Keir Starmer is not crazy and is doing, I think, a very credible job of dealing with some of the more worrying, from a voter's point of view, elements within his own party. We cannot control that. I think also we have to recognise that the majority that was won in 2019 was the first major majority in decades for the Conservative Party, and you don't tend to get those majorities every time. And the reason that that majority was possible was because, as is always the case with large majorities, it was an alliance of different coalitions with very different policy positions. So I think in many ways, agreeing with James, the importance of this paper is, to me, as much about what are you trying to do in the next election, sorry, less about that than it is about how medium term do you want to position the Conservative Party in terms of what it says, what it does, what it believes in, to maintain a substantive coalition in the medium term. And there will unquestionably be vast numbers of policy problems and global events that whack us between now and 2024 that change the specifics of this. You know, when we wrote the 2019 manifesto, we obviously had no idea COVID was coming. We had no idea that we were going to get the first European war in decades. These are enormous global events that completely change the shape of the world, the country's finances, and therefore your policy positions. But what does seem to me the case is that there is now, for the first time, a very large group of voters in the middle, the working class, lower middle class, bulk of people across currently England and Wales, who felt culturally, and because they did not buy austerity and did not believe it was necessary, for the first time they were willing to vote Conservative. And my great fear, medium term, is that if you turn your back on those people, they will not forgive you for a very long time. And that is a very large number of voters to ignore. I also think morally, because there's usually a reason we get into politics and into policy. It's not just because we think Conservatives are good guys, right? We think that this matters because we think there's a policy job to be done. We're here to try and improve the country and improve people's lives. I think it is also unquestionably the case that those are people who have reason to feel left behind and ignored for decades over a range of really serious and substantive policy issues, economic, social, including areas like free movement, but also the fabric of their places. And having promised to do something about that at the last election, I think we would deserve to lose very badly if we chose not to try and keep those promises, and those voters would be reasonable to decide that they didn't want to stick with the Conservatives again, or at least for a long time. So I suppose what I'm saying is it seems to me perfectly possible that you could return to a smaller, because it was much smaller, Conservative government that was traditional in the sense that we think of 2010 and 2015 as traditional, which had policy positions to match, that were about fiscal conservatism, traditional enterprise, relatively low spending on public services. And that is electorally entirely feasible. Medium term, I think it would be bad, and I think morally it would be fairly unjustifiable.
Rachel, thank you very much. I'm conscious, I think, that James is going to have to jump off relatively soon. So I just want to pose one question to him quickly before he does. And then I'm going to come back to a few points that both Rachel and Seth made. And James, the question I want to ask you is about something that some people call the softball swing. So there is a phenomenon that some pollsters talk about whether or not new first-time voters for a party are likely to switch back to their previous party, or actually can be more likely to stick with their new party for fear of almost proving themselves wrong in their vote at the previous election. And I just wonder whether or not you think that there's any chance that the kind of new first-time Conservative voters in the 2019 election will actually turn out to be more likely to vote Tory next time, in the same way as we've seen in some US elections in recent years. How much credibility do you give that theory?
Thanks, Will. A very difficult question. I'll try and answer it as clearly as I can and speak a bit more slowly for all of our attendees. The case for the sophomore swing is actually some of the evidence of the 2019 election. The biggest swings were all in seats that the Conservative Party had won in 2017, often by double digits, and in some cases up to 20%, which is functionally about a sophomore swing by area. So I think there is good evidence of that. There is also evidence that the seats that the Conservatives won over from the Liberal Democrats in 2015 also benefited from the concept of sophomore swing. Once they were all won, functionally they became safer and safer and safer. But there's definitely the case. I think sophomore swing is particularly something that comes into play when the seat switches to a party that is a much better for that, better fit for that seat long term. So I'll give you a specific example. North Norfolk, which was won last time after Norman Lamb stepped down, that looks like a Conservative seat anywhere else in the country. You know, demographically, it looks like it's a really safe Conservative seat. So functionally, you might expect the longer term trends to take place there. But let me outline the case against and not answer your question at all. If you look at the polls, there is basically a pattern of LIFO, which means last in, first out. And what we're seeing is very clear evidence of people that lent their votes, leaving the coalition first. And I think that's something that's very visible and very present. So I would say broadly, working out whether there's going to be sophomore swing or not, or a discount, depends on the direction of the party, the circumstance, what the government does, the position that it's in, the position the opposition is in. Sorry if I haven't answered your specific question, but I think that the evidence cuts both ways.
Thank you very much, James. So James, if you need to jump off, please.
Thank you, pleasure.
So thank you so much for joining us. So I'm gonna kind of build on this with the question directed to Seth, because so you spent lots of time driving, I guess, around what is now called the Red Wall, and you've spoken to a huge number of voters and kind of understand some of the kind of political change in that kind of part of the country. How much do you think those votes were truly lent in the way that Maurice Johnson describes? It was a kind of almost a contract vote, is the way we describe it, deliberately trying to achieve a specific outcome, either to achieve Brexit or to define Jeremy Corbyn's chances of getting into Downing Street. Or how much do you think it was a kind of genuine appetite for a different political party and a different set of political policies?
Well, it was both fundamentally, but I think that message of get Brexit done was very compelling to people, but also don't forget that the manifesto that Rachel wrote was very clear at directing that need for change, and fundamentally that was what the Brexit vote was about in 2016. And also don't forget Theresa May did a lot of this material trails and something you will know with the jams, the way that manifesto was targeting the same kind of politics, but in a less effective way than in 2019. And the Prime Minister gets the idea that these votes were lent and was on the steps aside Downing Street when he said, you know, we put your trust in us, we will repay that trust. First of all, that was done by getting Brexit done. I know we can have an argument about what that means, and we can talk about it for the rest of our lives. But I think for most people, particularly if and when the Northern Ireland issue gets sorted, that would be Brexit done in their minds. But this, of course, points towards the levelling up agenda, which we're finally starting to come to some kind of fruition after 2 years. And obviously, there's not that much time left now until the next election. I think actually that is the greatest challenge for the Red Wall, is the delivery of hundreds, if not thousands, of small infrastructure projects across the country, and allowing the Tories to take credit for that and say, you know, we've done this, we've invested in your community, and vote for us to get more, essentially. And obviously they can use the pandemic and all the other issues to say, look, we haven't quite done as much as we wanted, but you know, we've given you a little bit of something. And there's some tangible stuff, some not tangible stuff that you can obviously point to on that front. I think, again, there is that issue of just 2 years have gone by where they've not done as much as the government would like to have done on that. And I think there's just a concern about grip on that particular issue. And obviously, the Prime Minister got that when he installed Michael Govin's Department for Levelling Up, as it's now called, and it's probably the minister's better place to do that. But a lot of it's not in his control. It's down to local governments, it's down to mayorities, it's down to county councils, district councils. And the question no one in White was being able to answer to me is, who's directing that? Who's overseeing that? Who is looking at the delivery targets from a political point of view? So when you get to the beginning of 2024, you can say, right, this is all the stuff we've done, this is all the stuff we can sell, and we can take it from there. The question about the Partygate stuff, which I think has been fundamentally very damaging. I've been back to a couple of the Red Wall places at the end of last year, and it was actually, because I partly assumed, oh, this is a classic Westminster thing, everyone being very annoyed about the government and the hypocrisy thing, but the sheer level of anger, and one of the things that Labour has done very well is to start doing this one move for them, one move for us, and they did it first with Bar and Castle. They then inexplicably dropped it. They've now picked it up again with Wallpapergate and Partygate and all that kind of stuff. That narrative, I think, is pretty compelling to me, because it plays in this sense of you trusted the Tories and Boris Johnson. They're just the same with Tories. They're not this new politics that Rachel was talking about, and not doing these new things differently. If they can feed that together into hard policy in terms of the economy, in terms of spending, in terms of the public policy decisions, that I think would actually be pretty damaging for the Tories come the next election. Then they've got to make the case on the other side of it, saying, well, actually, that's not true. We are different, and we are a new kind of Tories. And just come back to what Rachel said earlier about where conservatism and the rest of it should go. I genuinely think that there's not that much of a gap. I think the biggest gap is tonally, actually. If you look at the kind of the way the government speaks, sometimes it's very populist rhetoric about stuff. A lot of the stuff is still kind of bread and butter conservative stuff, you know, talking about illegal migrants and small boats, talking about running a good economy, talking about the cost of living. They're sort of all classic terrain that you play conservative stuff on. It's how you frame it and how you talk about it. And I think the last election, because you had that threat of Jeremy Corbyn, you could be a bit more populist and a bit more, say, Newkip in how you say stuff. The question is, if you've got the Lib Dems in a place where they can take advantage of it, plus the Labour Party that, to use Rachel term, is not led by a crazy person, that puts you in a very different place. I think that, and I think what would be interesting is how the Tory campaign actually uses the cabinet with this, because last time it was very much Boris Johnson. If you look, you've got people like Rishi Sunak, like Liz Truss, and like Kwasi Kwarteng, who can speak to a very different voter demographic. But in terms of the messaging, I think it's definitely possible to ride both horses.
Thank you, Seb. Rachel, so raised the possibility of Labour being much more competitive, partly because of leadership, partly because of posture. How does that play in policy terms, though? Because it feels to me that there's some of the big issues for the Labour Party in the next election: crime, immigration, kind of hard economic reality, especially with the kind of rising cost of living issue rising up with
jobs. That's not necessarily, historically, that's not natural territory for the Labour Party. How does Keir Starmer navigate that question, do you think?
So I suppose if you think about what the big policy tensions are likely to be, I think spending is going to be one of them. So the sort of three choices broadly are fiscal conservatism. You do not fund taxes or more public spending until you have brought the deficit somewhat under control, which I am not convinced is very appealing to this group of voters, but is appealing to the traditional conservative about that. You fund tax cuts, but not more spending, or you fund spending, but not more tax cuts. It seems to me that if the Conservatives stick with the first and not the second, they are more vulnerable. So I think that's a substantive thing. Immigration, I actually think in general, this government has been more cautious in talking about immigration than they would have been if they were wholly politically motivated. They tend not to like talking about it very much. It's another split in their coalition. But if you're worried about Farage, it's a split that really matters. I have no idea what they're doing about small votes. You may, because you're an expert and you spend your time thinking about it, but I haven't noticed anything.
I think voters would agree with you on that.
I don't know. I don't know what they're doing. So I think there are, crime actually, I think there were things that were interesting in the levelling up white people on crime, but delivery of them really matters. So I suppose that's a long way of saying, well, I think it's not necessarily natural territory for Labour. It's only not natural territory for Labour if the Conservatives themselves make certain choices. And I don't know if they can make those choices yet. I do think we also have to recognise, which is why, if I were an MP right now and I wanted to be an MP for the next 40 years, I'd be thinking beyond just the next election, not looking around the room, that the Conservatives have been in power for a really long time. And at some point people, the amazing trick of 2019, which was nothing to do with the brilliance manifesto, was somehow coming across like a first-time government. And it was an amazing thing. And normally you'd expect, without COVID and Ukraine and everything, and Partygate, that the next manifesto would be, well, let us finish the job. But actually, I think at some point, voters are going to realise that the Conservatives have been in power for a really long time, and maybe it's time for a change. So you have to think about medium term how you position yourself. Sorry, I'm probably talking too long.
No. I was just making sure that we don't run over, which is Cyrus. I'm going to see if anyone around the room has a question. Because I've been slightly hogging the mic. Does anyone want to come in?
I've kind of got one. I will risk feeling like I'm shouting at you so that everyone can hear online. My name's Elliot. I work for the Trade Association for the pharmaceutical industry. Really interesting as always to hear things. Thanks ever so much. I was going to ask a similar question to your last one, but actually, which is about the policy issues and how these knit together. So, Rachel, you said about the issues that were going to whack us that we didn't know about, and so you talked a bit about Ukraine and the cost of living crisis as well. Are there any other issues that you think present an interesting volatility maybe to this idea of like a blue ball emerging and how the red ball plays out? The ones that are the most obvious to me, I think, are around environmental sustainability, how the narrative of that plays, particularly with this coalition, the coalition we've been talking about really, and then secondly NHS recovery, which is obviously a big concern for members of Parliament. So they're the two that I can think of, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts if there are some others.
I think I agree with you, Elliot. Certainly in 2019, and if I've been working on it in 2017, and indeed straight after Brexit, the thing I'd have worried about most is can people get a GP appointment. And the fact that it's not all over the front pages doesn't mean it's not really bothering people. So again, to Seb's point, I think there's a perfect, beyond these kind of huge questions around spending, there's a perfectly reasonable argument that we don't need much more policy in this Parliament. What we need is relentless delivery of the policies that we've already announced and some proper weight behind them. And in areas where we have rhetorically announced policy, like in private sector investment, actually kind of turbocharging it a bit. And that is unquestionably one of them. The basic delivery of public services, of which health is always at the top, but which I and Seb have often talked about, just the fabric of people's kind of places, towns, high streets is another, seems to me central.
Sorry,
Sorry.
I completely agree with that, and I think one thing you're going to see is the post-COVID stress on public services, which is going to be huge, and I think is building up quite rapidly in these people's, and you're starting to get this sense people are just saying, I can never get a GP appointment, I can never do this, and the courts backlog, you're seeing statistics over prosecutions for rape trials is absolutely horrific. And you add all that together, and this comes back to the fabric porn, doesn't it? People just feel the state, society is not working for them. And of course, a lot of the red wall places, the infrastructure around their public services was worse because they had less investment over time than in poorer areas of the country that require more of a burden on those public services. Whereas in the south, you've still got that similar issue. And I think this to me is a big part of our general conversation, that we talk about money, but we don't talk about how the outputs and delivery of how you want to fix these things. So we've obviously got the national insurance levy coming into the NHS in April. How's that being spent? I don't know. Like, I've not seen a plan.
Supposed to be for social care.
Right, well, exactly. You know, and there's two big things where I could tell you what is the plan to make sure that within a year the backlog is coming down, the waiting lists are coming down. And obviously, I'm sure the Department for Health is working day and night on trying to get a plan for that together. But these are huge things that I think they're very tangible things. This will come back to the point of the next election. If your community doesn't feel like it's better and it's got more prosperous, if you feel the state is not delivering for you, and just that same old basic thing, if people feel they're not better off and richer, then they'll look for a change. And I think that trick, if we said 2019, of making the Tories feel different, one question will be is if there is a different Prime Minister, whether you can pull that trick again. So again, come back to this tonally. So for example, say Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, the book his favourite to be the next PM. Tonally, he would be quite different to Boris Johnson. We all know that. But policy-wise, I think he'd probably be quite similar. And I think if there is a leadership contest in the coming months, every candidate will be falling over themselves to get Michael Gove on board and get his endorsement and say Michael will still be delivering levelling up, because all the contenders know that is how you're going to win or lose the next elections, holding on to the red wall. So I just think that relentless focus on delivery on what the state offers is going to be the biggest policy thing. It's quite dry and boring, it's not exciting, but that for me is actually what we're going to decide and probably fundamentally decide the structural things of the next election.
I think it's only boring for the Muslims. It's actually more interesting
Or you
everywhere
just
else.
nerdy like us. Yeah. It's also not natural territory for the Conservative Party, right? I mean, getting public services to deliver for people is actually historically not what the Conservatives care about. They're much more about getting the state out of the way. So yeah, there's an interesting dynamic there, but I entirely agree with your points about the challenge being delivery, not message or policy. Feels like that. Yeah, it's been lacking. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to ask about Ukraine, because we are just entering what may well be a very protracted period where British politics, for the first time in a long time, is completely and utterly dominated by something happening not on our soil, not decisions we are taking, but something happening relatively close by that could have enormous ramifications for the future of this country and our global alliances. Historically, voters have thought that Boris Johnson is a strong leader, and actually it's one of the few attributes where in the JLP poll yesterday, Boris Johnson came out better than Keir Starmer. He was a strong leader. And voters also increasingly want strong leaders, we know from successive polling studies. I just wonder how you think that Ukrainian conflict, obviously in some ways it is not a political event, it shouldn't be treated as a political event, but it does have political implications. What do you think what might the effect of the Ukraine conflict have on British politics in the beyond the kind of day-to-day short-term stuff that we're seeing at the moment, in the kind of medium to long term? I'm going to come to Seb first, then Rachel. I might bring James in first, right, as well, just to give some thought on some of our polling from the past on what voters. So,
well, there's one very immediate thing, which is no one's talking about Partygate, and that's obviously been the biggest thing hanging over the Prime Minister. It's been depressing the Conservatives' poll standing and has given him these very poor personal ratings. And the fact is, when we're not talking about that, it starts to drift away. People forget about it. Of course, he's not out of the woods yet. You've still got the Mets to come to the conclusion whether he's going to get fined or not. Then you've got other people in damage who potentially getting fined or not. And then we have the full Sue Gray report to come out. So that is all going to probably happen within the next month. And while the Ukraine crisis will still go on. I mean, if you're Boris Johnson, it's obviously a dire situation, but the role he is now playing is kind of what he dreams of being Prime Minister, which is being a statesman, using Britain's soft and hard power to put it on the front of international events and to rise above the day-to-day, because I think it's very clear that this Downing Street very much likes to just ignore the Westminster Chatterings was true when Dominic Cummings was there, but has also been true since he left as well. And this is a news story where they can absolutely do that. And so in a day-to-day political sense, it is quite advantageous for the Prime Minister, even obviously despite the awfulness of the situation, and I'm sure you would not want this to be happening, but I think that is definitely moved inside his inner team. In the sort of medium policy term, that I think the biggest implications are, first of all, defence spending. That obviously we had the integrated review last year that had this big focus on cyber, on China, and on reducing the army. And I think you can probably do a countdown clock now until when those army cuts are reversed and we end up trying to beef up the British Army, which I think sort of happens every couple of years in politics. But obviously, what's interesting as well is there was a big focus in the integrated review on increasing Britain's nuclear stockpile, and given the message from the Kremlin about Russian nukes on high alert, that vindicates that in a way. And I think people in number 10 in the MOD say, well, this is why, because Russia is still has this as a threat that it wants to use, and you've got to remain competitive and for that to be taken seriously. So no doubt in the budget, I think there will be a focus on more defence spending, and I think that affects obviously Germany, and that overall sense that Russia as an actor has changed fundamentally with its invasion of Ukraine. The other policy in that review is obviously going to be economic. That these sanctions are big and wide, and I think at the beginning they were a bit of a pea shooter, as one MP described them to me, but then they multiplied into many pea shooters with poisonous darts in them, that will have a real impact, particularly the sanctions on central banks. And I think that in particular is going to have a big effect. So if this war is protracted, and it's going to cost a lot of money for Western countries, combined with the fact you've got these sanctions that will have a knock-on effect, because don't forget, if Russia's economy collapses, its debt pile is huge internationally, and it will have a much bigger effect on the global economy than the collapse of Lehman Brothers or anything you saw in the financial crisis. And then, of course, again, bringing it back domestically, but have impacts in terms of public spending here, what you can do with levelling up, what you can do with tax cuts. And then the third thing, is energy prices. I know it's also a tripod that's often made, but Russia has been limiting its supplies through Gazprom coming into Europe over the last few months. We're obviously through the worst of winter, which gives some respite. But energy, there's a very good chance the energy price cap will hit £3,000 in October. This protected thing that will again play into cost of living, particularly in the red wall. I think that we will get into a policy debate pretty soon about green levies, net zero, and is that the right thing to do? But if the government was to move away from that, that would then have an effect on the blue and on the south.
Yeah, indeed. Rachel.
I'm conscious that there are staggering unknowns. I would say at the moment today, I would think that the British public do not feel that the war in Ukraine poses a direct threat to themselves. That could change, and that will change politics dramatically. Nor would they feel the potential economic effects. And certainly wouldn't understand, but actually understand to a surprising degree the impact of Russia on energy prices from our polling, but still, not completely. And so the impact, I don't think it will make them forget other events. I think the public tend to forget much more slowly than Westminster does. Westminster's moved on, they've forgotten about small votes, they've forgotten about parties, they're on Ukraine, but that's not generally true for the public. And it, of course, further dilutes the ability of Downing Street to focus on anything else. And one of the things that I think we've seen over the last couple of months in domestic policy terms is that we're back to what I thought it was like in 2010, which is policy is entirely dependent on whether there's a specific Secretary of State or department that's serious and has ideas and can follow through. It has nothing to do with the centre except in spelling in strict terms. So very, very short term, I actually think it makes delivery less likely and it doesn't particularly change things. Medium term, I don't know, I wouldn't have predicted what the First World War meant. I don't know.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I'm asking impossible questions. I'm going to come to James and then I think we need to wrap up.
Sure. So on the kind of what voters want from the government or from their leaders, and the point that Seb made about strong leaders is definitely true, and that bears out in our polling and sort of yes as well. Voters do like strong leaders. That's especially true among the Conservative coalition. That was kind of abiding view of Boris Johnson at the time. It drove that view of him. Second point I'll make is on the one rule for them, one rule for us. That's very powerful. That's come across in our focus groups as well. As well as the polling, going back years ago, most voters do tend to think the government either is not working for them and in their lives. And I think the final point is that people want the government to get on with the job. That was the kind of success of get Brexit done. And in our focus groups in Oldham, for instance, recently, the kind of abiding view of voters that they want the government to just achieve something, essentially, rather than just talk.
No, indeed, and it speaks very clearly to that point. I think everyone has said that just the challenge now is which comes from the fantastic. I'm gonna call proceedings to a halt there. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in and to the people who were able to join us in person. It's been a fascinating conversation. I apologise for the sound quality issues. That's something we will resolve for next time. It's entirely my fault for insisting that we tried to get a panel in person rather than doing it all by Zoom because I, like lots of people, am sick only engaging with people through my computer screen. But thank you so much. Please do visit ukonward.com to view the full report, and I look forward to seeing all of you very soon. Thank you.